All right, we're here with Marc Miller, Minister Marc Miller, incumbent MP and candidate for the Liberal Party of Canada for the riding of Ville-Marie-Le Sud-Ouest-Ile-Des-Soeurs. Could they not have chosen a longer name there, Marc? I mean, does it even fit in your poster?
It was. This is ancient history, but it was a NDP Conservative coalition that picked out the name, which is particularly fitting in this context of an election. But that happens to be the facts of history. But it's when I talk to people outside Montreal, they're like, "Where the heck is that?" And I just go, "Home of the Habs. We got more Stanley Cups than all the other ridings put together."
Exactly. Before we start, Marc, I need to ask you, how are you? How are things? Very difficult year that we went through. On a personal level, how's it going?
It's going well. I became a minister, as you know, in 2019, with already what is a very, very challenging file for Indigenous peoples and my number one job, which is to close socioeconomic gaps, and that's outside a once in a lifetime, let's hope, pandemic. And so, within the first few months, there were protests and solidarity movements for the Wet'suwet'en people and their land rights. There then broke out shortly thereafter a global pandemic, and knowing what we know now about what was then an uncertain virus, something that would and could have been very devastating to Indigenous peoples, and we have numbers from the CDC in the South to prove out what that's done in certain communities, Indigenous communities in the U.S. So it was a mad scramble on top of all the other issues that are what is Canada with respect to a broken relationship with Indigenous peoples, and then a global pandemic and a rush to keep things safe and to make the machinery of government move as quickly as something that moves ridiculously quickly, which is a virus. They don't take weekends off, and I've been scrambling 24/7 with a dedicated team and a big department to help keep people safe, and the results are there. I sort of reflect on this and say to myself, if the Prime Minister asked me when he appointed me to this position what my ambition was, and I'd said to keep people alive and safe, probably would have been fired on the spot, because that's kind of like a duh moment. But it has been the number one priority in this context. And then there are all the other ones that I'm sure you want to dig into or talk about what's going on in my riding, but they deal with issues that predate Canada. So it's been a tough year, a very busy year, but it's a job that I've taken to heart and put in the work ethic necessary to complete these difficult jobs.
Tell me a little bit about becoming a minister. How is that like? Is that the file that you had hoped for? Like, when that call comes in and, they tell you, all right, Marc, you got to be at this hotel early in the morning. Don't tell anyone where you're going. Don't tell anyone what it is. You're going to meet someone in the underground parking garage. They're going to lead you to a room. Like, when that call comes in and you're obviously thinking, okay, I'm being called in to be given a spot in the ministerial caucus, what's going through your mind? Is this what you're thinking, or is this what you were hoping for? What was that moment like?
Yeah, it's not an underground garage. It is a place in Ottawa typically that is outside the public scrutiny and public eye. So that becomes a choice of location, but it's not as dodgy as a parking lot and an underground parking, but it's...
Yeah, well, I know, because I've heard provincially, I mean, everything is kept, really, really concealed. Nobody, they don't want anything to come out. I mean, I've heard stories where it's like, look, you're going to go, they're going to meet you, they're going to, accompany you, you're going to put you in a room, like everything has to be so secretive. So I don't know how it is federal.
Well, there are no secrets in Ottawa. Everyone talks, and that's the bit of the challenge, to keep something quite confidential. There is an extensive vetting process that goes on, and those, a number are reviewed and selected, and that process is extensive with an external panel typically. And then there is sort of that magic that is done with people that see where the fit is, and then the offers are made. Typically, as a new minister, you don't have the luxury of choice. Rarely, as an incoming minister, again, do you have the luxury of choice, despite what people suggest. So, I was given the offer by the Prime Minister. It was with some trepidation. I did reflect on it. I knew that this was a massive task. It is something that the completion of the work that we need to do to move along the path of reconciliation is something that will outlive governments, but we need to put the right conditions in place for the closure of what is an insidious form of discrimination, which is that socioeconomic gaps to close, which is my number one task in health, infrastructure, education, all these things that give people an equal shot in life and haven't been afforded to Indigenous peoples. And so, you have all these things running through your mind, and I accepted, obviously, but with some trepidation. And I think it is a reflection of some of the work I've done in understanding of the files. And then comes sort of the massive avalanche of documentation and briefings and extensive work. This was right before an AFN General Assembly a week later, so I had to get briefed up on all. There's 600 nations across 600 plus First Nations across Canada, plus Inuit and Métis. So that is for any person a steep learning curve, and there is no real preparation for a job like this. And it is something that I've actually. It's difficult to say that I really enjoy my job, but given the level of challenge with the issues and the painful legacy of this particular department that I run. But I do enjoy my job. I love it. It is something that I enjoy doing, but I feel that my job will be incomplete unless I put in place the conditions for the next person to thrive and the next person to succeed. And this is a department that needs to change. It's shown extreme nimbleness during a pandemic, so I have a lot of hope. And I see some of the progress that we've made. I see some of the political and financial capital that we've put into it, and I am quite hopeful. And so, I know you asked a different question, but it was a difficult job. I wouldn't say I hesitated, but I did understand the weight of it when I was offered it, and I did accept it.
We're going to talk a little bit about the details and the challenges, especially the last year that you had to face as a Minister of Indigenous Affairs. But before we do that, let me just talk a little bit about the campaign, the start of this campaign, which was met with a little bit of adversity, especially during the first week, where a lot of people are questioning if whether or not this was the appropriate time to launch a campaign at the beginning of what seems to be the fourth wave, or depending on the province and the health experts, some suggest that we're already in it. In your opinion, was politicizing COVID-19 and using that as a pretext to launch a campaign the right thing, or was it a mistake? How do you view it?
Well, bear in mind, as you know, George, it's August in Quebec, where people don't really think about politics, and then everything ramps up in September. But there's a couple of things that sort of have played into the beginning of this campaign. I would say COVID has always been politicized, and we've done our best as a government to stick to the medicine, stick to the science. But it is a political issue, and we are at a pivotal point in time where we've hit 80% vaccination, and we need to finish the fight. And there are parties that are willing to take a political stance to please their base and compromise finishing the fight. And I think that needs to set into people's minds. The Conservatives we've had elections during world wars. The Conservatives, the Bloc and the NDP have voted for motions that would have thrown us into an election. So knowing that we are a minority, knowing that there are diminishing returns for opposition parties that support a minority government as time runs on, I don't think it's credible to hear any sort of opposition party saying we were ready to support you for the next 2 years. I suspect, and people will yell from the roofs that I'm wrong, but I pretty much know it to be true that we probably would have been in an election in 2 months anyway. We have a moment in time to finish this fight. This is it. And I think people need to scrutinize the party's platforms in that optic. You have a Conservative Party that is willing to give anti-vaxxers a choice as to whether they compromise the safety of people that are unvaccinated. And that, we all believe in choices, but there's not freedom of consequences. And those consequences in a world pandemic are quite dire. And so yeah, we're in an election. I think we need to be speaking about these issues and getting them out. September, particularly in a province like Quebec that gets really warmed up in September politically, what I've seen from my previous campaigns, and I'm sure you'll echo those sentiments having run yourself. Things can move quite quickly.
Right. It's interesting what you're saying. I mean, from the very beginning, Justin Trudeau came out and kind of drew a line in the sand and said, this is where we stand. We need mandatory vaccinations. We need vaccination passports. And we saw kind of the effect it had. I haven't seen such, violent and vulgar campaigns, and I've had a few. I mean, it's normal to see people during a campaign yelling and screaming. It's fine. People are camped in their own ideologies. But what's happening this time around, I got to be honest with you, Mark, I haven't seen anything like this. I'm just wondering. I mean, you're a lawyer. You obviously know this much better than I do. Can you do that? Can you force, and we're not talking about our personal, I mean, I'm vaccinated. I got both my vaccinations because I believe in, this whole process, but I'm just looking at it from the other people's perspective, and I'm trying to take in their argument. Are we allowed to do that?
I think it's important in a democracy such as ours, George, to listen to the other side. It's a fundamental tenet of our democracy to listen to it. When we talk about freedom of expression, we've had some very hard and difficult debates over what are those limits. I will defend someone's freedom of choice and freedom of expression, but if I disagree with it, I have every right and obligation to call it out. And that's the exchange of ideas that we have in a democratic society. I think we've gotten into a situation where there has been some confusion between rights and privileges, and those people that take that choice not to get vaccinated have to realize that comes with consequences. Is there a right to travel without certain conditions being fulfilled in Canada on a plane? You can't board a plane without a T-shirt. So come on, this is a world pandemic. People need to get vaccinated. If those who have chosen not to get vaccinated and are ignoring the sciences and the best analysis of experts out there have to wait a little longer to enjoy some privileges that we fought so hard as a country for, well, that's the consequence. There's no freedom of consequence. And that, I get it. There obviously during some of the Moroni campaigns over NAFTA, I was still quite young, not a teenager, but there was that level of vitriol. I do think to your point, I do think it gets magnified exponentially in an internet era with Twitter and Facebook and all that. I'm not a stranger to protest, as you know. Some of these feel manufactured. Like whether they're manufactured or not, there's a weird feeling to them. And I don't know where it's coming from or what the idea is. Is it to destabilize a campaign? Is it to people that actually believe in what they're saying?
But it's still there, Mark. It's still there, and it's in large numbers, right? So, I see these guys yelling at kids, and you're like, there's something wrong. And and I'm gonna call that out. But again, we're in a world pandemic. People's health and safety are the number one priority. 80% of us have taken that decision to get vaccinated. And then some of those privileges that we enjoy are slowly being restored. And if you want to run a campaign defending, 10, 15% of people that are going to compromise the safety of the rest of us, including our youngest and most vulnerable, those 11 and under, I don't find that acceptable. Mm-hmm. I want to ask you a question I've asked all the other candidates that have been on. And again, I've done a lot of campaigns. I'm trying to think if ever I've seen this before, but I don't think I have, where a party goes into the lead in a campaign. We're talking about almost nearly 20 points ahead, and within 1 week to lose that lead, and especially within the first week, I don't think I've seen that. I mean, how do you interpret this? How is everyone's spirit in your team and in general in the Liberal Party? I mean, to lose that advance in 1 week, and look, some may see it, not that bad because it's still early on in the campaign. There's still another 3 weeks left, so there's always time to turn it around. And I mean, the Conservatives took the lead of about 4 or 5%, which, in elections lingo, it's almost negligible, right? I mean, but there's, we're looking at the momentum now. Are they going to be able to maintain it and take it on and, grow that gap? Will the Liberals be able to kind of maintain it there or take back the support they had? But in any case, dropping 20 points like that is quite significant for 1 week. How did you see that?
a lot of us will say we never look at polls. That's the line. We don't look at polls, but we certainly don't look at them in August. And that's really the reality of the situation we're in. I think you could tear them to pieces all you want. Where trends are going is anyone's guess. You could say Liberals were artificially high. I'm not going to speculate. The reality, I think you'll certainly hear folks like Mulroney say they carved out or ate at someone's lead. I haven't looked back at the history of things. I actually personally don't look too much at polls. I do look at them, but I do know polling in August is highly unreliable. And I think you do have to you have to factor in the tragic events that have overwhelmed everyone in Afghanistan, where we're just realizing again that there's a failure of moral values, of foreign military financial policy over the last 2 years, 20 years, 50 years, 200 years in a country that has a notorious history with Western powers in Afghanistan. And, that seizes the imagination of many people. So, whether that influences the poll, I suspect it probably does. Every life that we're getting out of Afghanistan, we've gotten 300,000, 700 in emergency situations, knowing that we haven't been present militarily in 10 years is a real victory. But every life left behind is a tragedy. And that's what we're composing with as a government. In my own department, I do remain the minister, but I also have emergency functions that are occupying me as well. So that's the challenge of being in government, and that's what we've said to Canadians we'll continue doing, and that's what people expect us to be doing. So the reality is we're ready to finish this. This was the better time than perhaps in 2 months or 2 months prior to let Canadians decide on an issue that they had no real choice over in the last election, because in 2019 we didn't know at all about COVID. Mm-hmm. It's time to finish the fight, and we're ready to do it. And I think people should be paying attention to the next 18 days.
Let's talk a little bit about a file that has preoccupied your time quite a bit, obviously as a Minister of Aboriginal Affairs. This has been a very difficult year. I mean, tell me a little bit, your reaction following, the discovery of all these remains that kind of surged this year. How did you manage this crisis?
Look, it's no surprise to anyone that I'm not Indigenous. I was on a phone call with, or Zoom, like everyone else is doing these days, with Indigenous doctors, and these are people that it was a Thursday night, I believe, and these are people that are used to dealing with death, used to dealing with trauma, particularly with their own people, and I think pretty much every single one of them froze at the breaking of the news about the discoveries in Kamloops. And so and these are people that are highly trained to deal with trauma. And so you can imagine the ripple effect that this has had in Indigenous communities. There isn't a single Indigenous community that hasn't been affected by the news. And as the news keeps coming out, people get re-traumatized. It has opened up old wounds that people thought had been closed. It's been a shock to people who knew that was the case all along. And then for the rest of us who were not educated to know about this and chose not to read the Truth and Reconciliation report or even the summary or even understand what was going on, a shock, but it was not a surprise for those people who had lived it and experienced it and the successive generations that have suffered the trauma from it.
Right.
It is complex. It is a very, very painful situation. What worries me is what happens when this all falls off sort of the national attention span and Indigenous communities are left picking up the pieces. So I visited about 6 sites or 5 or 6 sites in the last month or so, or 2 months, including one in Lower Post, BC, just on the border with the Yukon. I visited the Kamloops site and Shubenacadie in Nova Scotia. and each community has its own reality of what that site is, what it represents to people. You have to remember that a lot of communities were sent to those sites. So it isn't one community, one site, and their own people. In the case of Kamloops, it could be several dozen communities that had their children stolen and taken to these institutions that were, in fact, labor camps, not schools. So, where do we go from here, I think, is everyone's question. What people are asking from Canadians is a little bit of understanding, non-Indigenous Canadians, a little bit of understanding, a little bit of compassion. And for those of us that have the privilege to be in power, the financial and political capital to help with the healing and closure. And what does that healing look like? Sometimes, there are still survivors that don't want to speak about their experience, and we need to honor the courage of their silence, as well as the courage of those that are speaking out to the next generations that are demanding answers. And that comes with financial support for mental health, tearing down of some of these buildings and building them up into institutions where people can thrive, whether it's a multiplex sports complex or refurbishing these buildings to preserve the memories. Each community has its own process, and we need to respect that. But this process will be much slower than the immediate thirst for answers that we're all looking for. And
right.
My only conclusion to all this, George, I know I'm taking up all your time, but the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is quite clear in this. We need to let Indigenous communities lead. The federal government, who is part responsible for this, can't be the face of this. We need to get out of the way, give the financial resources, and help these communities. But it's not us to come up with the answers. It's really for the communities.
Right, because, for everyone watching, these things that we saw, this isn't something new. We've known about, the existence of these graves for years, if not for decades. We've been made aware of the atrocious conditions that these communities have had to live in. Why has it taken so much time to arrive at this point? That's what boggles a lot of people's minds. Why has it been so complicated? And the other thing that I've been thinking is, had we not had all these events a couple of months ago happen, would these communities have had any attention at all? It feels as though there was finally a spotlight on this issue just because of this situation, right? I don't know. I just feel like our governments only take action whenever a major issue rises, rather than addressing the problem in order to avoid a crisis. I don't know. Am I wrong to think that?
It's a combination of things. I don't think that's the entire picture. There are situations where governments certainly need a kick in the butt to move, and that's no question. For years, and it's important to back up on this particular issue, the calls to action in the TRC 71 through 76 did call on the federal government, provincial governments to assist communities. We had budgetary allocations in budget 2019 in particular, and grants to the SSHRCC and through Heritage Canada that were supporting a number of these searches. But remember, this is work that's been painstaking. There's obviously been an evolution in the technology. Everyone now is an expert on ground searching technologies, but those have evolved. And so there has been a better ability to get a sense of the truth. In the case of some of these larger institutions, many of them doing this for a long time, listening to the truth of the survivors since the 70s, with, I would suggest, not sufficient funding and backing that they were entitled to rightly. There have been many movements to preserve some of these institutions and memorialize them. We've moved on that, but arguably, in the light of these devastating discoveries, not fast enough. And so, I guess, to have a more nuanced approach to the premise of your question, we were moving on it. It is slow, but clearly now there is a call to move much quicker, but also respect the pace of communities. There's an important point that you made in your introduction to this question, which is, how come we didn't know? And I believe we were taught not to know. I wasn't raised in school to learn about this, and you probably weren't either. I've had recently, very elderly Holocaust survivors approach me and say, "How come, this pains them, because it's reliving some painful memories for them." They're saying, how come we didn't know about this? How come we didn't? And I have no answer for it. I truly don't. But I do see hope. We can no longer deny this history, and I think we have, as a society, done so. We need to listen to the survivors. We need to give them a place on Canada's stage to speak out, as painful as it is, about what exactly happened, so that we can teach our generations and successive generations. I take hope in my own kids that are learning this in school at a level that I never learned it at. So there's hope. It's slow, but I think it is eventually good for this country that we all know it. One of the themes that I do want to address, and it isn't coming out as much in sort of some of the mainstream analysis I read, is the message of hope that I've come out of every community hearing. Where we go from here, and it is a fundamental belief of hope from Indigenous communities that we can do better. One of those hopes is in education, making sure that schools are built on reserve and culturally appropriate teachings in the spirit of self-determination is lifted up. I've been to a number of communities where we're opening up new schools, and that is the future. And we're not reproducing a broken model of shipping kids off reserve. They can learn in their own environment, their own culture, their own languages. And that increases factually graduation rates, but it also plays an essential role in reclaiming identity, which we've denied communities for so long.
Marc, let's talk a little bit about the economy. And I'm sure you're getting heavily questioned about this in your writing or, during your door-to-door. We're very far from the promises that were made in 2015, in terms of, running mild deficits and balancing the books in 2019. Of course, nobody expected the pandemic to hit, so we further indebted our population. How can your electorate, how can the population trust that you are the right party for the job when all they've seen are record deficits, record debt, no indication of any return to zero deficit? I mean, the finance ministers have been quite good at avoiding that question. Is there really a plan to get us out of this? And if there is, do you think it'll work? Can you inspire that confidence again to the electorate?
I think it's safe to say, George, that every day we continue to be in a global pandemic, we continue to dig a fiscal hole. The only way out is to finish the fight and to have the backs of Canadians like we've had up to now. Clearly, no one anticipated a global pandemic. And luckily, the fiscal tract, as compared to similarly situated OECD countries, was great. And in low interest rate environments, which I agree don't last forever, borrowing is an important instrument to get growth that can then in turn retire the debt, pay off deficits. And that's a key fiscal measure that we've used. There has been this mantra that is that leads inevitably to slow growth, that debt is bad at all costs. And the Prime Minister defied that in 2015, and people said, you know what, he's right. But it has to be justified. You're right. And the clearest justification right now is we haven't finished the fight. So when you have parties that are willing to toy with what is an economic challenge simply to please their base, I think that is a real threat to the economy, because there's nothing worse than a shutdown. Now, we as a government stepped in the place of civil society and private business, which is not the place of government. You only do these in exceptional circumstances, global recessions, or world pandemics. And that was the right thing to do. The whiplash effect is that there are unanticipated consequences, and these are hammer-type measures for what is often needed as a surgical solution that the government isn't necessarily good at replacing or simulating instead of private capital. Now, there will have to be adjustments as we are moving into a reopening phase. Rationing back of supports, tailoring of supports. We know that the hospitality and tourism business will hurt longer, but always in a way that is fiscally sound. Now, my proposal to you and to Canadians is that getting out of this pandemic is the number one economic priority, as opposed to going back to old dogma that doesn't reflect the fact that the health and safety of people is so key. It's something that we quite easily forget outside pandemics.
I know you got to go. We're going to wrap it up, Marc. Let's talk a little bit about what's happening on the ground in Ville-Marie-Le Sud-Ouest-Ile-Des-Soeurs. What are the challenges that need your attention over there? What are you working on, or what do you look forward to continue to work on should you get reelected?
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked that, George, because like any urban center, child family poverty and cost of living is a huge issue. From day one, from 2015, with the Canada Child Benefit, we have got money into those who need it most, families, into pockets of Canadians directly from the federal government. People always say that in Quebec in particular, the federal government is far from them directly. And this has brought us closer to them. And it is something that we needed to do, recognizing that there were inequities. Those inequities continue to be there, and we continue to invest in families. Some of our initiatives on childcare across the country are a reflection that we've had on workforce equity, particularly women being able to leverage their workforce and not being unduly prejudiced by having to raise children in a way that you and I wouldn't, as a matter of course, haven't had traditionally to do. Those are things that we need to keep working on. It's actually quite fiscally sound for the economy. Now, housing is a big issue. There's been real inflationary pressure in the cost of housing. Our government was the first in a generation to invest in housing. We reached a deal with the Legault government that has the primary jurisdiction on housing in the height of the pandemic to invest $3.7 billion over 10 years in a joint housing strategy. That's good news, but we're not really stopping there. We've deployed throughout the pandemic a rapid housing strategy of $1 billion and are re-upping that in budget 2021. In addition to a number of pretty exciting platform strategies that aren't gimmicky like some of the other parties, in making sure that people do have access to housing directly for the next few years. And this is the federal government's involvement in things in a respectful fashion, of course, but making sure that we are recognizing the fact that there is pressure, whether it's foreign speculators that don't intend to live here or blind bidding. We need to be able to be working to make sure that pressure isn't on people that really should be having a roof over their head. Those challenges need to be matched as well by the cities and by the provinces, and we need to work respectfully with them to do that, which is what we've done. But that is certainly something: cost of living, housing, health, and again, I'll go back to this. We need to finish the fight against COVID. And this is the only government that's put forward a platform that really recognizes that and has that as its number one focus.
Marc, I appreciate your time as always. I know you have a busy schedule. The campaign is still going, still active. I mean, like we said, there's still 3 weeks. Anything can happen all the way until the very end. So good luck to you. And hopefully I'll see you soon.
Thanks, George. Hopefully next time we can do it in your car again.
I hope we don't screw up like last time. I have to repeat it. All right, Marc. Take care.